Good morning, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Niagara Graffiti. I am your host, Shawn LeVick, and today we are joined by Niagara Falls Mayor Robert Restaino, and we are also joined by Managing Director, author, practitioner, teacher in the field of asset-based community development, connecting in from on Zoom from Ireland, Mr. Cormac Russel. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me this evening.
Thank you.
Um, this is definitely something that I've been wanting to put together for a while, and the mayor is new to being sat starting in 2020. But I remember a few years back, I had actually tried to connect our former director of community development with Cormac. So this is something that I've been trying to do for quite some time. I've followed Cormac for about 6 years now. And I've learned so much in the field of me, is the best way that I could put it. How are you gentlemen this morning?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for having me on with you today.
Mr. Russell?
And likewise, it's great, and I'm very very excited by this conversation. Excited to hear what's going on for the mayor and what his vision for the future is, and how community features in that. And obviously, it's great to meet you as well. So I think this is going to be a great conversation.
I think it is, and I've been, like I said the other day, I greatly appreciate both you gentlemen this morning. I looked at both of you guys for mentorship and in my own background scene. I got told Mayor earlier, I pretty much watch everything he puts out. Any video that you've ever put out, I watch, just because I think that the message that you put out and the way that the mayor feels, just from my perspective, are together without even knowing each other. So I kind of feel like the community needs to hear this conversation, because a lot of them don't take the initiative to change themselves. And that's what I gathered from you, Mr. Russell, is that you have to be your own spark in your own community, start that fire of change.
That's right.
I guess I'll start with the questions, Mr. Russell. Where I can easily say that my interpretation of asset-based community development, could you give us a more professional definition? Obviously, you've been dealing with it for 25 years, more than that. Could you give us a clear definition of what ABCD is?
Sure, as best as I can, but I'm sure it's just going to be different, not necessarily better than yours. In a sense, when if we stand outside our, if we're in a house outside our house, or if we stand on the corner on our block and we look around, there's things we can see quite obviously, maybe cars, other people, some dogs, that kind of stuff. There's a lot of stuff that's visible in our neighborhood, and maybe even visible to ourselves when we look in the mirror. But then there's a range of things that we cannot see, that are essentially unseen or invisible to us. So we can't see all of the gifts, the knowledge, the skills, the talents of our neighbors, especially the ones that we maybe don't like, because it's hard to see beyond those labels. We can't often see the associations, the clubs, the groups, the social networks that we're not members of. And we can't see the cultural resources that exist in our community, because often they exist in ways that we don't get invited to. We can't see the different ways that local economy works, how because of certain local mama and papa stores, a dollar goes three times around the community instead of once, like it does in so many other communities. And sometimes it's hard to see the way the physical, natural, and built environment either works for or against our relationships with each other. And it's also true to say that invisible in our neighborhood sometimes are the stories that hold us together, that weave us together. So you could say we live in both a visible and an invisible neighborhood. And I guess what I'm really interested in is, what might we do to make the invisible visible, so that we can have a vibrant life together? What I've just described to you is ABCD.
So, in essentially just going out into your own communities and finding the assets to create that community, but also identifying the resources that we have around us that make us who we are. Now, being from Niagara Falls, New York, where we are right now, we have an abundance of natural resources, and I think in a lot of ways the people here don't see themselves as a resource. They don't see themselves as an asset. They don't take their quality of life standards by the horns and create that change. And a lot of that has to do with, for me anyways, just speaking for myself, pre-Mayor Restaino, we've had community development here, and it was a different kind. It was the institute-based development that actually, in one of your talks, you started out saying that they are put in place to help, but in all reality and at the end, they hurt communities more than they help. My next question would be kind of leaning towards, Mr. Mayor, could you give us an idea of how our community development used to work? Because you're dealing with a lot of that even now, you're still dealing with.
Well, community development, there's a lot, there are different aspects of our Department of Community Development. I mean, some of it deals obviously with housing issues and assisting people in that space. And other aspects of it deal with how do we best use federal funding to improve the community. Prior to, and let me just say that I appreciate and support and recognize the need for parks and playgrounds and all of those things, and they're certainly necessary. But our community has an awful number of parks and playgrounds pre the last decade. As a matter of fact, our community enjoys the second largest urban park in New York State, behind Central Park, in the Hyde Park facility that we have right in the center of the city of Niagara Falls. It isn't necessary, although it is important, to make sure that different sectors of the city, the 17 square miles, that there are also neighborhood or locations that are closer for young families and children to enjoy. But I do believe that prior to our entry into City Hall, a lot of community development effort was spent in those areas that ignored the kinds of things that are more bread and butter for neighborhoods and communities, whether it's streets and sidewalks, whether it's blight and decay. You could have some of the most beautiful parks all around, but a block behind that, if the neighborhood's falling apart, it's really not contributing to the benefit of the community. So since arriving, we're completing a pocket park on Garden Avenue, but by and large, we've plowed much of the money into trying to improve the way neighborhoods look. And that is those buildings that are owned by the city that are blighted, that need to be removed, we've removed them. Obviously, there is an abundance because they've pretty much been ignored over the last decade. So we're playing catch up. There's no doubt about it. And I'm sure that as people listen to this, they probably have 4 or 5 locations in their neighborhood that they wish I was out there taking care of right now. And we'll get to them. I mean, obviously, we have a process, we have a schedule, and we're working toward it. But I think our focus has shifted from just trying to check boxes and put things in place that might seem popular in terms of how you look, to really trying to make sure that we're doing some things that are fundamentally important to the community. You know, we can build a better neighborhood by first cleaning it up. Mm-hmm. And to clean it up, you have to take responsibility. The city owns many properties, and we have to take responsibility for removing those that are creating blight in neighborhoods. And again, we haven't taken all of them, but we're taking as many as we can as the money will allow us. Moreover, we're doing our best to also hold accountable those private property owners that allow their properties to fall into neglect. That's a little more complicated circumstance here in the States. It involves us having to give proper notice. It involves us having to make sure that we provide an opportunity for the private property owner to make repair. And then always remember that when government goes and takes action based upon the failure of a private property owner to comply with codes or to make sure that they're taking care of blight, if we have to take action, for instance, in some circumstances, remove a building that's blighted, that's privately owned, we're spending taxpayer money to do that which a private property owner should have the responsibility for. And so we do that judiciously. We take that seriously because it's taxpayer money that's being used for a private property purpose. But we do it when we have to, and we do it when we can.
And piggybacking off of that, I guess this is aimed towards you, Cormac. In many communities here in New York State, like you said, you can go out to the corner, you can see assets, and you can see good and bad. We have many identifiable issues, most of which happen in normal post-industrial era cities. We're in the Rust Belt, be it Niagara Falls. Most places going downhill since the 60s after industrial era. So we deal with a lot of those issues: crime, blight, drug use, lack of economic development. And it becomes a custom for most people to jump on social media and just complain about it, rather than taking the initiative and going out there and applying themselves and doing this change. But at the same time, as the mayor has said, there's a wall when it comes to certain things where community can do things and where they can't, where it comes into things that might affect collective bargaining agreements with unions that might create an issue with inside the bureaucracy of local government. And I know you're in the UK, but you over here as well, University of Chicago, and you probably have an idea of how a lot of bureaucracy works. Is there any instance where you can give advice as far as somebody from my standpoint that's just a community builder or a community member, not so much a community builder, that would give them the encouragement to work, go to city council meetings in a more professional fashion and address them to want to come alongside the government and work together?
So I think what's important from a community perspective, and we can see things through the eyes of the state and we can see things through the eyes of the citizen. So just looking through the eyes of citizenship, and not all citizens are seeing with a citizen lens. Some may be seeing themselves through a different perspective, as somebody who is the sum of their problems or needs or a client or other labels. But just looking at things through the lens of citizen, the lens of neighbor for a second, which we all are. We all come from somewhere. I think it's helpful to not immediately jump into the conversation about how citizens can be in better relationship with outside institutions. We can get to that. But I think there's an earlier conversation. And that's the conversation around how we can be in better relationship with each other as neighbors, as citizens, as associations. And I think often, we hear this, particularly in the US when I travel, I hear a lot of talk about responsibility, and I nearly always reframe that to the ability to respond. I have a conversation with somebody, I say, what would you love to do to make your street better? And it goes one way. But if I have a conversation with somebody where I say, what would you love to do if 3 of your neighbors helped you? Goes another. When I have a conversation with somebody who says, here are 3 neighbors and they care exactly about what you care about and they're up for a conversation, would you like to come bring a beer? We go another way. So my point here is that we've got to be able in our communities to convene conversations with folks who may not necessarily feel that they're able to respond. They have the ability to respond. Everybody does. It just, sometimes it's about removing barriers. Sometimes it's about giving people space to actually get their head around it. But my experience has been that in most places, and probably all places I've ever been, I've worked in about 36 countries around the world, so you get a lot of diversity there. Most people are waiting to be asked. Most people are waiting to be asked. And, the ask isn't, will you come and volunteer? Will you come to a meeting with the city? In the first instance, the ask is, hey, you do this podcast. You seem to know what you're doing, Shawn. You seem to be able to communicate. You seem to be able to, string a sentence together and ask good questions. We could really do with your skills. Here's how you could be helpful. Would you help? Most people, in response to something like that, say yes. So there's a whole process, I think, and a way of framing this in terms of democracy, just to broaden it out. If we think about a 3-lane swimming pool, there's stuff that people can do in their neighborhoods that's about neighbor to neighbor. It's not about changing City Hall. It's not about changing the world. It's about, here's what we need to do here. Back in the late 80s in Upsumstraat, which is a street in Rotterdam, people spent years trying to get the city to clean up their street. One day somebody in a meeting walked out, got a sweeping brush, and started sweeping their own street. Others followed. Mm-hmm. That movement today, 30 years on, is a movement of 2,500 streets that are organized, that are purely citizen-led. When they sit down and they talk with the mayor of Rotterdam and the executives of Rotterdam, the conversation they have is very different than the conversation their forefathers had before they swept that street. You see my point? Mm-hmm. So we grow power from inside out. It's like an egg. It hatches. You apply force from outside in, you smash everything. So there's something about community has to be hatched from inside out. That's the first lane in the swimming pool. The second is, like the mayor is saying, sometimes communities need help. Sometimes things have gotten so problematic and it's so divisive in terms of relationships that you've got to create some kind of ground within which people can step into safely. But there's a psychological safety. And I think that's right. So it's about being proportionate. As the First Nation wisdom would teach us, you got to be in right relationship when you do that. So that's about how do you not bring the heavy hand or the crushing hand of the state, but how do you lift people up and give a proportionate amount of support, which isn't about taking over or solving problems that don't belong to you, but it's about creating a dome of protection for people so they can step into their own inventiveness. And then I think there's the third lane, which is a whole set of things that city has to do, right? There are things that communities need done for them. There's no point in making an argument against that. And I think sometimes people hear about asset-based community development and they hear, well, that's all about community good and institutions bad. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's kind of a pretty unsophisticated way of understanding what we're talking about. What we're talking about here is right relationship. Because outside institutions, the mayor can't know what a neighborhood needs until the neighborhood knows what it has. That's the bottom line. And we have got to figure out, citizens aren't people crouched over kindling waiting for the mayor to light their fire. Citizens light each other's fire. And then when they sit with the mayor, they say, here's what we've done. Here's what you could do to supplement our capacity. So this isn't about, begging bowls or rescuing or come fix us. That narrative is a narrative that doesn't actually lead to power. It leads to a huge amount of dependency. So we really need to change that, but that takes work and time.
May I, Shawn, Mr. Russell in a baseball metaphor, he not only hit the ball, but it's out of the park. The key to it is the community doing its own thing first in its neighborhood. And I think the last portion of what you said is so appropriate. To ask government to do everything creates dependency rather than independence. And so it's the conversation about Rotterdam is amazing. The idea that residents and citizens did something on their own. It's not that I'm suggesting to anyone who's listening to this that the residents of Niagara Falls should grab brooms and go sweep streets.
No, you should get out there because I do it all the time. Get out there and sweep your stuff up.
But the idea is that it was a community-led, a neighborhood-led, an individual-led enterprise project. It wasn't, you have to do this, government should do that. The state running everything isn't always going to be the best process. As I said just before coming on with Mr. Russell, local officials are elected for the offices they're in. I was elected mayor, not king. And I don't have the capacity to say, okay, this is what happens in the realm. So I think it's important, particularly in a place founded on democracy, it's important not that democracy means I get to come to public meetings and scream and yell at what government's not doing, but democracy is the freedom to say, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to the corner of my neighborhood and see what's out there, and I'm going to do my best to make my neighborhood okay. I shared with these gentlemen, Mr. Russell, I got sworn in January 1st, 2020. I asked residents then to do one thing. I asked them, clean your front yard. If you clean your front yard, your neighbor's going to see it and they'll clean theirs. Mm-hmm. And if your neighbor's elderly and she can't shovel her snow, help her out. If he's too old to cut the grass and it's too hot out, help him out. If we build that community, the rest of it just starts to take its own shape. I mean, the rest, and you're right, government steps into those areas that just can't be done by individuals. And that's really where I think government is best capable to operate.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I, more so, like I said, it really...
Yeah, completely.
My transition is completely correlated with my finding your video on YouTube. Like I said, 5-6 years ago, I started getting out in the community and literally started cleaning up with hand grabbers. I live right across the street from City Hall, so I walk from Cedar Avenue, which is a street on the other side of City Hall, all the way down 3 or 4 blocks and then up the other side to clean my neighborhood. And it is contagious. I do have neighbors that used to live in homes where they didn't care what it looked like outside and stuff would be bad and, trash all over the place. And now if you drive through my street coming up to City Hall, I personally feel a sense of pride knowing when I look out the window and see the mayor sitting at the light, which I do often. I see him sitting at the light right there at 7th and Pine going to his office almost weekly. I feel a little bit of sense of pride in the fact that he rides up a neighborhood that is clean, or I feel absolutely horrified if I look out and see trash out in the neighborhood. And I think that's how a lot of people have to live, not just because it's the mayor pulling up, it's anybody, but the underlying people that I feel that get hurt by it are the children in my neighborhood. And that's why I go out and do what I have to do, because I don't want my kids looking out and seeing trash all over the place or, needles or whatnot, things like of that nature. And it really...
If I can ask a question real quick.
Mm-hmm.
What can we do to motivate people to actually go and, take part?
That would be Dave, my co-host. Yeah, I asked what could we do to motivate, and that's another question that I wanted to run into is with the mayor. What could we get motivate people to help? And what areas would you like to see people that what's in their capacity of helping?
Well, I think that the first piece is having a sense of pride in your place. You have to want to take control of your own environment. And if you take control of your own environment and have pride in it, you'll do those things that are necessary to keep it right. Some of the things that I'd like to try and do at City Hall is develop an environment that elevates the pride of the community. We've talked about a couple of things in our economic development discussions, little things that might give the city residents a sense of pride in place. Having been here my whole life, born and raised here, I remember, and this isn't the immediate answer for everything, but I remember the community used to have city-based sport teams. And so you had a pride in place that this was the city's baseball team or the city's whatever. And you start to begin to identify as a place that you can be proud of. It happens in many communities with their high schools, with their high school sports. But I think it starts with having pride in your community, and then obviously pride in your place. If you're a part of a community that you feel proud to be in, and it's easy to not be proud, it's always easy to be the person who points the finger at the things that need to be changed. it's much more difficult to be the person who sees through those things to that which makes Niagara Falls a special place to be, and then say, how do I make my little space better? Imagine for a moment if everybody's square yard was all that you focused on and everybody was doing that together. The 17 square miles of the city would look a whole lot different.
Oh, and if I can get Peter to queue up, I don't know, will he be able to see the video or the pictures also? Will you pull up the garden picture? Not the one with the mayor and Kenny, just the one with Jackson, or just the one by itself.
There it is.
This is actually a garden done by my 5-year-old son that the mayor and the city council chair awarded him a Good Neighbor Award last year for. And in a way, that is kind of what the mayor is speaking towards. And obviously, both of you gentlemen understand it. But as far as people that may watch this, it's taking that drive that we have inside ourselves and applying it. And for me, it's taking, because I'm lazy, taking that drive and making my kids do it for me. And then, but it did catch on, and there's other people that that have done similar. You know, we have homes in the area that are actually going out and doing these things. Now, I wouldn't advise anybody else to do this because of where it's at. It's actually on city property, but I did this before. I started doing this before the mayor was elected, so I was grandfathered in, if you will. But next year, and if you pull up the fence one, we have one, and if I can get the mayor at some point to come out and autograph his, because he's the second person from the. I started painting a fence out of pallets that I found from laying around. And I ripped them down and I sanded them and I repainted them, and I added different elements, different people, and my goal is when people see it, hopefully they'll do something similar to their area and within their own citizen space, create their own kind of beautiful thing on their, with the resources that we have around, because it is a pre-COVID, 55% of Niagara Falls population was sitting at or below the poverty level. And that was pre-COVID. So after COVID, it's probably a little higher. And I think that if people went out and did these small things for themselves, just the feeling they would get from themselves, the self-gratitude would empower them.
That's right.
And that kind of leads me into another question with festivals, community festivals. When I was growing up, Niagara Falls, New York, and Niagara Falls, Ontario shared something called the Festival of Lights during Christmas time. And it always seemed like it was a community thing. And I think that's something that, do you feel that something like that, driven by the community at a large scale, because it does encompass the entire city, but me personally, I feel like that's a situation where local government and state government and the community of Niagara Falls, being at the ground level, would have the best ideal of what would make the wonderfulest Festival of Lights come together if they came together. And what are your views on that?
Let me say, if I may, just say a few things to kind of break this down a little bit, because there's a lot of really important things being said, and it's important to just step them out a little bit. So the first thing I heard the mayor say, which I think is really important, is it's about invitation, not mandate. I'm not the king. I can't mandate you to do anything, but I can invite you to recognize yourself as a citizen and to do something modest but meaningful that's going to enhance your life and enhance the life of those around you. And I think that's a really smart thing to do, because it's a smart use of power. So it's saying to people, that I believe in you and I'll cheer you on and I'll create the conditions within which you can be powerful. That's really important because not everybody believes that. And if they've been through blight and they're living through economic challenge, then it's really important that somebody in your position is cheering people on and standing in awe at the way they live their lives. Now, both of you, I think, I sense, is you believe in people. And you recognize that, there's my dog in the background there, but you recognize that people need to be invited into finding things they care about enough to act upon. And this is really critical. In a time when people are being drawn in on social media to express opinions about what others should do to act, which is totally the opposite of what we're talking about. It's distracting, it's disempowering, it's disabling, and it's dividing. Mm-hmm. It's dividing nations, not just the US, in the UK as well, we see it. We're seeing it in other nations too. So when people get to express opinions are like noses, everybody has one, and we normally stick them where they don't belong. So that's fine, but opinions don't build community. Opinions don't build a life. Opinions don't even build an economy. They're just opinions. People and place are real. If I have to make a decision between foregoing being right or wrong on an opinion and standing by a place or a person, I'm going to stand by a place or a person because that's real. Opinions are just ideas. And the problem is we have media that is shaping culture badly because it's reporting on people's wounds. It's polarizing, it's dividing, and sadly, in some instances, we have some leaders who, unlike the mayor, are actually using their leadership to further divide and polarize. Mm-hmm. So where does the leadership need to come? I think it needs to come right up close in to where we live our lives, near our own doorsteps, and I think that's going to take some community organizing. In Milwaukee, the police are recognizing that using public money just for enforcement and sometimes for very violent enforcement is not a good way to build a safe city. And they're pushing enforcement money, police money, out of police in through the lens of public health. And they're asking really clever questions. Why is it the same 15 neighborhoods are producing the alumni of our prisons? The same 15 neighborhoods are producing the alumni of our hospitals. Alberta, the state of Alberta, spends 50% of its tax take hospitalizing people. And this is bonkers by any standards. Mm-hmm. And when you hospitalize somebody over the age of 65 for too long because they have nowhere to go back to, then you're making them sicker, not better. So you're literally using public money to do the very opposite of what public money is intended to do. Why? Because they don't have a community to go back to. Whatever your question, community is a central part of the answer. And the real challenge here is that we're using money in health and law enforcement and in other areas to create the opposite of what we intend. So I think a lot of people hear what we say when we talk about community and think that's a nice to have. It's nice to sweep your neighbor's, front porch or whatever it might be if they haven't physically got the ability to do it. But it's bigger. And I really want people to understand, our conversation is not a quaint conversation. Your future depends on it. Your safety depends on how many neighbors you know by first name and how often you do stuff together. Your future well-being in terms of whether you age isolated and lonely depends on how connected your community is. What kind of fabric? Now, to go to your question with regard to festivals, if we were in a position where we were able to say, whether we like it or not, people need some support connecting with their neighbors. They are not just going to wake up one morning, listen to a podcast and go, I've seen the light. It's not going to happen, right? So some investment needs to be put in and it needs to be taken away from somewhere to be put somewhere else. It's just the bottom line. Moving monies that are either engaging in counterproductive activity or just treading water is something that leadership is all about. It's like President Biden said, don't tell me your values, show me where your budget is, and I'll tell you what your values are, right? So how a city spends its money is its own business. That's an elected process. I don't want to interfere on that. But what I do want to say is that if we can move even a modest amount of money out of acute healthcare in the city, if we can move a modest amount of money out of harsh enforcement, if we can move a modest amount of money into long-term, jailing and imprisoning, and move it into creating neighborhood pool budgets, and actually get city to say, we seriously legitimize and invest in the neighborhood as the primary unit of change in this city. And we're going to support you, not do it for you, but we're going to support you to get organized and get connected. Not so that you can come after the city. I mean, do that if you want. But in the first instance, so you can tap into what you have and use that to get what you need, and then hold us to account around supplementing that. So you get your bread buttered on both sides. But that's going to take some investment. And when you look at what's happened in Seattle, for example, where they've really, it's changed a little, but over 20 years, they've really invested through the of neighborhoods and trying to think very differently about how neighborhoods are funded. So the small sparks and the neighborhood matching fund schemes, I think, are neat and good ways, but we need more. I think we need to literally have people who are skilled enough to go into neighborhoods and really start the connecting work and start the work that enables people to see, I am, you say this whole idea of getting people to do something in place. The first step is people have to believe, I am somebody. Mm-hmm. Shawn, you believed you were somebody who was worthy to go out of your private domain into shared space and say, I want to define myself by what I contribute to my neighbors, because that's going to help me, my kids, and the wider community. You defined yourself at that moment more by what you give than what you receive. There's a lot of people in your community who are just waiting to be invited into that space, and you get that modeling. So there are others like you. But I wonder what would happen if there was a community builder, like in Edmonton, for example, where the city of Edmonton now are organizing again at neighborhood level, using asset-based community development to reveal the abundance. So they're changing the conversation. Instead of what's the matter with you, they're asking what matters to you that you'd be prepared to share with others that are living in this neighborhood. And I think some of that needs to be done. COVID in 2000, March, maybe April of 2020, precipitated a neighborhood response. In Italy, people were serenading themselves at each other from the balcony. In Ireland, we had street bingo where people were wearing hazmat suits and all kinds of crazy things. So somehow COVID precipitated that. Now I think people are fatigued and they're tired, and different things are happening. But the question might be, what could you guys do to precipitate in a positive way, post-COVID, the kind of neighborhood connecting and neighborhood impulses? And again, I love the fact that you're making this a modest ask. This isn't about being St. Francis of Assisi. This is about doing what makes sense, safely, manageably, within a threshold. Nobody's asking you to talk to every older person in the neighborhood. The mayor has been very clear. It's a backyard revolution. Right? Mm-hmm. Start small, follow your energy. If you got an impulse to do what Shawn's been doing with creativity, follow your gift. We all come bearing gifts. But so often, years of poverty make us think we are the sum of our problems. We are needy, on our knees, beaten people. And I guess the message here, with absolute love and respect, is you're not. I remember many years ago, somebody stood up in a conference that I was speaking at, and they had been off drugs for 9 months. And they used the expression, I've been clean for 9 months. And somebody else, a wiser person in the hall, stood up and said, well, that's wonderful, but you got to recognize something. You were never dirty. So find better language, So I think there's something in there about that, the convening. One quick story, if I may, and this is a story about a mayor who's very similar, I think, to Mayor Roberts, because he was mayor of Amqui, which is a much smaller, I suppose, area, if you like, but Amqui is on the Atlantic side of French-speaking Canada. So it's a fishing town essentially, very reliant on salmon fishing. And many years ago, as the story goes, a number of neighbors ran up to the mayor, speaking French as you'd expect, telling him that a poacher had cut the nets so the salmon were escaping. And that was obviously a very serious matter for the town. Their livelihood depends on the salmon. And the mayor's response was to say, well, obviously that's a massive issue. What do you think we should do about it? So the guys started speculating on some things that they thought should be done. And the mayor said, well, they all seem like really good ideas. Do you know anybody who could help with those things? And they said, yeah, we know a few people. So the mayor said, well, get them together. Let's meet. They met at 7:30 that evening, as it so happened. And about 10 people sat around. The mayor sat and listened and chaired the meeting, if you like. And at the end of it, he said, these are all good ideas. And I think mostly they're ideas that you have identified, that you want to implement. So it seems to me you guys are all citizens here, because citizens do three things, right? They define the problem and possibility in their own language. They define the solution in their own language, and then they're the primary investors in making that solution happen. Doesn't mean they don't need outside help, but they don't come with a begging bowl. They come with an investment. We've jumped, follow, right? So he said at the end of the meeting, so that's how it seems to me. So from my perspective, I just want to legitimize what you've done. That's one of my functions as mayor. I can legitimize you. So he said, I think you're acting like the first salmon preservation society of Amqui. And they all kind of felt quite good about that and said, well, yeah. He said, well, let me legitimize you. I now officially recognize you as such. And then he asked one or two other questions about how he could be useful. And they said, well, it would be helpful if we were able to check in maybe every 6 weeks at council and just let you know how we're coming along. And also, if we need help, let you know what that help needs to look like. He said, that's absolutely fine. And by the way, now that you're official, you've got meeting space here. Once you follow the booking rules, get your name in the book. This place is your place. It's not mine. And afterwards, John McKnight, who's one of the founders, the founder really of ABCD, asked the mayor, asked the mayor, so how often do you do this? And the mayor said, how often? This is all I do. But he said, the thing is, everybody in Amqui is a citizen, and they're all members of committees. So, it's just an illustration, I guess, of how we embed this in the culture. So it becomes the way we do things around here. Now, then, when people like that organize a festival, what they're doing is they're doing something that is an expression of we, of us. It is a cultural expression. It's not let's organize a festival to lift people up because they're destitute and they're down and they don't have anything nice to go to. So we don't treat people as needy. We treat people as needed. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, you say, there is already culture in your city. Let's discover what it is. Let's lift it up. And then let's connect it so it can become more fruitful. And out of that, create your festival as an expression of all that wasn't connected, but is now. And I think if you do that, then the ritual, the culture will be sustained. It will be owned by the people. The one thing I would commend you not do is organize a festival for people, because that's to totally misunderstand what festival means. Feast, right? Carnival. And of course, the carnivorous, the meat eater, it's a time for mischief. It's a time for wildness. It's a time for adventure and dreaming new possibilities. That's got to come from the people.
I think in a lot of ways where I should have kind of guided it was more towards the story of Frank and the Black Pearl. How the was it Brighton Beach? The one gentleman started picking up driftwood and created the Black Pearl boat. I think it was your TED Talk where you spoke about Frank and the Black. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of how I envisioned a lighting ceremony. Celebrate the holidays around here. But to me, it also breaks off to being multiple things. You know, the psychological benefit of togetherness and
Beautiful. Yeah. And you're restoring something that was there before, Shawn.
mm,
So you're not introducing something new. You're saying, if you think about, I should say, incidentally, I'll have to go in about 7 minutes just
mm,
to mention that. But if we think about this idea that this was there before, people have a memory. So it's like a remnant of a culture that was. And what you're doing is you're bending over and you're blowing some just gentle sort of energy in on top of the embers and saying, come on, don't you remember? And I think remembering works both ways. It's the recall, but it's also reconnecting, remembering.
mm,
And when communities become dismembered by blight, by economic recessions and so forth, you've got to kind of rekindle or remember them back into some kind of sense of hope. So I think your instincts, your impulse are impeccable, and your impulse in terms of how to convene, how to bring people together.
mm.
It's quite beautiful.
I'm actually going to be quiet for the next couple minutes. If you guys would like to go back and forth with any kind of closing questions, or I don't want to take up too much more of your time.
No, listening to Mr. Russell, I will tell you, before coming on with you, we're trying to reestablish our city farmers market. And to Mr. Russell's point, I was out there just kind of giving those farmers who are there a sense of what my goal is to try and bring operation back into City Hall. But to your point, while out there, I said to the farmers, once that's done, I want to sit down and talk to you about what you need. I'm not a farmer. I don't know what would be necessary to recreate this farmers market. They need to talk to government about how do we assist them in reaching the goal they look for, or reaching those things that they need. So I think it's really critical that this really becomes, as far as the community is concerned, their ability to organize their thoughts. And then obviously government lends a helping hand in those places where it can, but also sometimes it's best for government just to get out of the way. Dictating a festival, dictating how I've never been a fan of that throughout my professional career, and now that I'm at City Hall. And so it just becomes really, as Mr. Russell has said, it has to be organic.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that's really striking as well is more and more when people are given the space to organically do things and a little bit of support, sometimes they become undone by the story or the narrative that says the only way things are going to get better around here is if somebody from outside comes in to make them better. And so I think that a useful outsider, which I really feel both of you are taking on the role of being, but particularly you, Mayor, you're holding that space so powerfully in a lot of ways and so gently in your power, and saying very, very clearly that I can't know what you need until you first have a look around and see what you have. And I actually think what you have is a lot more than you think. So, many communities are hair triggered in the US to come with a shopping list to city government, to police departments, etc., to foundations, and to be profoundly disappointed, or to get the funding, jump through the hoops, and then come back next year and become even more dependent. And I think what we're talking about is we're not saying that people should be denied funding or should be denied services or should be denied support. But we know over and over again, when government is on top rather than on tap, it simply doesn't work for anybody. It burns out staff in City Hall, and it results in appalling outcomes, which then 10 years later have to be cleared because they're blight, or whatever it might be. So we need a better way. We're clear on that. I don't think anybody listening would argue otherwise. But some of that way is very fundamentally about you can't know what you need in your shopping list until you check and see what you've got in your cupboards and what you've got in your refrigerator. And Shawn, that's what you're modeling. Mayor, that's what you're calling forth and holding. And I think what's really important as well is you guys are holding the gap in between citizen space and City Hall. And there's a kind of a borderland, wherein we can either have massive institutional encroaching on community, where everything is about fixing the broken people, or we can sort of occupy the gap. We can mind the gap and say, folks, there's a sequence that works here. There's an optimal sequence, and history shows us to be right in this. If you guys start by building on what you have, discovering it, connecting it, and mobilizing it, we will supplement your assets and we will build something that's sustainable for the city, for the planet, for the environment and the economy that you can be proud of, and that will be yours, not done to you or for you, but with you and by you. And that's the essence of it. I'm often shocked that people would argue against that, either from the left or the right. But I think when they do, it's because they can't see themselves in the story. And the point here is that everybody has something to bring to this story. The one thing you can go and have a job and never, ever work to your strength. But if you go in your neighborhood, there is something that is needed and it needs your gift. Nobody's contribution is surplus to the man in the neighborhood. That's the beauty of the neighborhood. It's the nursery of democracy. And it's the one place neglected over the last 10, maybe 15 years. It's time to restore the village.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just want to thank Mr. Russell for his focus. But go right ahead, Mr. Russell.
No, I was going to say I'd like to invite the mayor to close. I think that's fitting.
Thank you so much. I think that obviously the conversation today hits at really what it is that this administration hopes to bring to the city. It's a different way of looking at how we grow. I appreciate your insight, and I think that those who watch this will see that this isn't some wild-eyed scheme or some crazy harebrained idea. It's something that organically builds what I think makes for stronger community.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Russell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Russell.
Take care now.
Pleasure. Thank you. Go well.
You too.
Mayor, thank you.
Everybody.
It's lovely to meet you. Shawn, thank you.
Thank you very much, my friend. Everybody, that was Cormac Russell, Managing Director of Neutral Development, author of Rekindling Democracy. This is Mr. Mayor Robert Restaino. I greatly appreciate you coming by today, sir.
Thank you so much.
I think that was actually a great conversation, and hopefully you guys can have more conversation. That was the main goal, was making this connection right here. It was less about the podcast, but it was still a great way to put my podcast out there. Appreciate it.
No, that was great. That was great.
It was a great conversation, and the thing is, like I said, you can find Mr. Russell on YouTube. You can find all of his stuff going back 5, 6, 7+ years. The mayor's always at his office. People, if you guys go down there, there was a statement made at the last council meeting by Chairman Tompkins about going there in the appropriate way to react. A lot of people need to come to understand that to solve our problems, we need less emotion and more fact. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Niagara Graffiti. Have a great weekend.